Hey everyone, welcome to the Neo Marketing Podcast. My name is Kyle Golding here with my co-host, Rich Pritchard. Good to see everyone again. We have a very good, great, awesome, interesting two-part podcast today based on the crisis communication presentation that you and I did a couple of weeks ago for the YMCA for the National CMO event.
Yep.
Welcome to the Golding Group Neo Marketing Podcast, a bi-weekly discussion of modern business communication. Two-part podcast today based on the crisis communication presentation that you and I did a couple of weeks ago for the YMCA for the National CMO event.
Yep.
An hour and a half in front of communication professionals, so you know we dug deep to give them a ton of detail.
Right.
I'm good at it, you're great at it, so this is your thing. I'm going to ask you questions and I'm going to let you drive this today.
Okay.
We're going to have the presentation itself here.
Okay.
And folks, don't forget, in the links to the show, however you find the show on iTunes, on YouTube, etc., all the places you find the show, there will be a link to this slide deck so that you can see what we're talking about and see the whole presentation. So, you ready?
There you go. I'm ready. Let's rock and roll.
Let's start with the basic stuff.
Okay.
The definition of a crisis.
You know, the three things that we typically always think about, try and define a crisis, is that it's a surprise.
Right.
It's not the normal stuff, right?
If it was the normal stuff, it would just be normal stuff,
It'd just be normal stuff, right? Exactly. Maybe raise your blood pressure, but
Sure.
it's not a crisis. Threat is a critical piece of that. We always come up with that because a crisis can threaten the organization's achievement of its goals. It can threaten its bottom line, can threaten its reputation.
Right.
And then the third piece of it that we usually think of is that you don't have a lot of time to respond.
That's right, because that's where the stress comes from, right?
Yes.
Is the immediacy of the problem.
Yep. So we went on to define it. My favorite authors, Ulmer, Seeger, and Selnow, been researching crisis communication for a long time. They have a more positive and opportunity-centered definition of crisis.
Well, you know, I'm a big believer in taking negative actions and items and turning them into positives.
Yeah, and a lot of the scholars in the crisis communications world are looking at responses, response types. They're coming at it from a defensive standpoint and not an opportunistic standpoint. Scholars debate it, but many people believe that the Chinese symbol for crisis is dangerous opportunity. And so Seeger, Selnow, and Ulmer have defined for us a crisis definition that has some of those aspects in it.
Right.
And they are, yes, it's unexpected. You come to work one day and 60 minutes is sitting on your front doorstep, right?
It happens.
That's not a good place to be, but so you can expect the unexpected is basically what they're saying.
Yes.
It's non-routine, which means that your normal procedures are not going to make it go away. You have to come up with something unique and often something pretty aggressive.
Which is why you need further planning and a process and then training and review throughout the year because
Absolutely.
It is outside the norm, right?
It is outside the norm, non-routine. The routine stuff isn't going to cut it anymore. And we'll talk about plan versus protocol here in just a minute.
We'll talk about it a lot.
A lot, exactly. It produces uncertainty, not just outside of the organization with the stakeholders, but inside the organization. You don't know what happened. You don't really know at that point how to fix it.
Right.
So there is a lot of uncertainty in a crisis.
There's no set way to handle every crisis.
No, not at all. And we're going to tell you the plan is dead.
That's right.
Long live the plan.
There's no such thing as write it down once, one size fits all.
Right, exactly so. And then here's where their more positive approach to crisis comes in, is that it presents opportunities that may not be there in the routine, opportunities at the end. If you do a great job with it, as we're going to help you understand, then you have a reputation boost. You can have, you'll find out real quick who your supporters are. I mean, you can change your business practices a little bit to prevent it from happening again. So there are lots of opportunities.
It's okay to have a shortcoming, a failure, even go through a crisis, have a negative item happen. The response to it is where the potential for opportunity is.
Absolutely.
Because you can respond poorly and make things worse, or you
Absolutely.
can respond well and actually maybe even come out better than you started.
Right, exactly so. And it's not just words, it's deeds
Right.
as well. So, and then, of course, the last piece of their definition is that it's a threat to the image or the reputation or the high priority goals of the organization.
And if it wasn't a threat to those three things that are super important to every brand and business, then it wouldn't be something we would be applying this much stress over.
Right, exactly.
So when it comes to actual crisis, there's a lot of different things that could fall under the umbrella of crisis. How do you differentiate these types of crises?
Emergency versus crisis. A crisis is all the things that we just talked about. There's uncertainty, there's opportunity, but there's a threat to the reputation and whatnot, as opposed to an emergency, which is something that's very short term, one time, and you just
Very
take care of it.
specific, yes.
Right. If the fire bell went off now, it would be an emergency. A gas leak is an emergency,
Yes.
but not necessarily a crisis. If you don't deal with the emergency, it could turn into a crisis.
And then
But
sometimes that emergency attracts attention, and then there's when you're not prepared, it can become a crisis.
absolutely, that's absolutely right. Risk is something that folks tend to equate to crisis. They're separate, but they
Right.
are connected. Risk is what you are willing to accept. We risk ourselves every time we get on the highway,
That's
but
right.
we're willing to do that.
And every business has risk. There's no perfectly safe idea of running business. And in fact, the more aggressive and the more disrupting of an industry or making waves or having a lot of success, which of course is drawing attention within the industry, creates more potential risk.
Absolutely. And sometimes you can accept too much risk and it
Sure.
turns into a crisis. Point of order is WeCo, WeWork, that has expanded. They tried to pump out an IPO at $47 billion.
Big mistake.
It was, and so now the CEO has Hitley Bricks, and
He's outta here.
He's out of here, and they're struggling with what their next steps are. And
I tell you, folks, we could do a whole podcast on this, and maybe someday we will, on unicorns, false unicorns,
Right.
rapid extinction, and sort of death by success,
Yeah.
growing too fast and not having proper structure in place. It's a whole different subject, and I
bet.
promise we'll do a show on that sometime soon. Okay,
But that would be an example of risk being too much risk, accepting too much risk that turned into a pretty major crisis that it has impacted their bottom line and may impact the rest of the organization going forward.
I wouldn't be surprised if it maybe ultimately doesn't kill them.
Yeah. Well, I don't expect an IPO out of them anytime soon.
that was a
They
mistake.
got to regroup, right? And disaster, of course. We live in Oklahoma, so
We know what disaster
tornadoes.
Right?
We just went through a horrible hurricane through the Bahamas. Those things have very, very special attachments to them, points that you have to pay attention to.
Yes.
The crisis is definitely embedded in that, but a disaster presents a whole different set of challenges.
Much bigger and completely out of your control.
Absolutely, absolutely. And by the way, if you don't handle the disaster right, you do create a crisis, and Hurricane Katrina and the way FEMA took care of it is a
Yes.
perfect example.
And that goes back to what I said. If you respond to a crisis in a great way, you have the potential to move yourself forward.
Right.
When you respond poorly, when you fail, when you fumble, then you have egg on your face.
Absolutely, and more than that.
When you are the scale of the federal government, there's a ton of egg to go around.
Right, exactly, and you're knee deep in something for sure.
Right. That's a lot of subsets of what a crisis can be, but ultimately there's really two definitions of crisis when it comes to how you're going to respond.
Well, this is Mrs. Pritchard's little boy vision of a crisis. I like to keep things simple, and there are lots of typologies of crises. Tim Coombs does a whole continuum. I have to break it down into
me, I'm a
something
fan
simple.
of simplicity.
Absolutely. Keep it simple, silly. So I categorize them as unplanned and planned. Now, nobody plans to have a crisis.
No.
You don't walk in the office the next day and go, okay, I think I'll create a crisis today.
But you can see things coming.
Absolutely, and that's what I mean by planned. You've got enough time that you can marshal your resources. You have timing, the timing over when you make announcements, when you engage with different stakeholders. One of the questions I got this week from an organization, a nonprofit, a function of a decision that the board had made the night before. It involves laying off people. It involves labor unions.
That could get complicated.
It can get complicated, but they know it's coming. So
Right.
That's what I mean by planned.
That's a great example of a planned crisis that you can't stop it, but you can prepare for it as much as possible.
Exactly. And that's really important because your success is directly proportional to how you plan those first responses.
Yes, for sure.
Okay. The other is unplanned, and that's
what people probably assume what a crisis is always unplanned.
Right.
It's not, but that's what we think of a crisis, right?
Exactly so. And that would be food recall or salmonella.
Yeah, product defects.
Defects, something that
scandal with the leadership.
Right.
And that could be something as small as a local issue, like getting a DUI or a domestic violence issue. Not that it's a small issue, but it's a local, all the way through federal investigations, right?
Right. Well, it's a surprise. I mean, hopefully you didn't plan to beat your wife or
hopefully not.
Spouse or get
or drive
drunk.
DUI,
I mean, and that's
as the CEO, right?
There's the calculus.
When the CEO gets a DUI, it becomes
it's
news.
a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a crisis. It's sudden. It's unplanned.
Right.
You have to go with what you've got. You don't have the opportunity to marshal the resources, and you have to respond like right now at the same time that you're trying to find out exactly what happened.
So whether it's a planned crisis you see coming or unplanned, there are different stages of the crisis itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where do we start? Where's stage one?
This is based on our experience. The stage one is the initial reports, and that's usually today. That's usually social media.
That's first.
That jumps on.
Right.
And by the way, the haters always come first in a crisis.
That's true.
There's no reliable information. Things are operating an awful lot like a rumor in terms of information at that particular point. So that's how it starts.
This is a spot here, and for those of you listening who are communication professionals, I really want to kind of drive this point home right here. A lot of people panic right here.
Absolutely.
Because it looks bad, it sounds bad, and it's everywhere, and it's fast. And you obviously, if it's something unplanned, you're caught by surprise. And for the communication professional, you really feel upside down, having zero control of the process, and everything you're seeing most likely is inaccurate. Or where did that even come from?
Right. Exactly. Right. So, in Darden Foods, with the rumor that Olive Garden had contributed to the president's campaign. They had a foolproof answer, fortunately, but they spent 24 to 48 hours trying to wet on that fire. I mean, somebody came up, it was a rumor on social media. So that's initial reports.
They forgot the first rule of all communication, which is the truth will set you free.
Absolutely. The truth will set you free. And they managed that crisis very well as a function of that truth.
Eventually. They were slow to it, but eventually they got the simplest version of the answer, which was we don't do that at all. So you can't say one side or the other.
Right, exactly.
But they were a little slow to it.
But and so that's initial reports. Usually, in my experience, our experience, you find out about stuff through the call from the reporter. And that's the initial phase.
I've taken those phone calls.
Yep, absolutely. So the second phase that we see is initial reports, first reports, and that's when the newspaper first publishes the story either online or in print. Radio stations pick it up.
And social media spreads it like wildfire.
is still going strong, right?
Yes.
But now what we've got is demand for action. Mm-hmm. You know, after the doctor was drug off of that United flight, there were certainly demands for action that the airlines needed to do something different than beating people up to get seats.
Right, exactly.
Right? Certainly search for details, but then there's the search for the witnesses, right? What'd you see? And I don't know what it is about natural disasters, but usually that's that middle-aged guy lacking a couple of teeth going, all I heard was a freight
comedians
train.
have been making hay for years on the terrible people who show up on TV after a natural disaster.
Right, exactly.
But it happens.
But that's what they're they're looking for.
Yes.
That's in the first to report, the second stage of a crisis.
So what comes next?
Well, third is sustainment. That's when you're wall-to-wall CNN. You're getting second guessing out of everybody. And by the way, if you don't talk first, then somebody's going to talk for you, and you're not going to like it.
Exactly, which is why speed is an issue we'll talk about
Absolutely.
later.
We'll talk some more about that. And so we're looking for causes. We're looking for victims now. And by the way, my good friend Jim Lukashevsky says that anyone who thinks they're a victim is a victim. So, you can't look for blood. You can't look for broken bones, right? If they say they're a victim, if they think they're a victim, they are. And the media are looking for those people. They're also looking for causes.
That becomes part of the story.
Absolutely. And then my favorite part of sustainment is the urban myth conspiracy theory.
Yes, my favorite too, because these things get way out of hand super fast.
Yeah, just wacko. There are still people who think that the Navy shot down TWA Flight 800 shortly after takeoff back in 1980.
People who still think that we faked the moon landing.
Right. So I just... from a professional standpoint,
was that during our presentation for the YMCA? There was someone yell out "Flat Earth." They
right.
said they're flat earthers.
Right, flat earthers, right. Exactly.
Maybe the world's oldest conspiracy theory.
Exactly. But from a professional standpoint, it's always interesting to me to see which conspiracy theory is going to come up. Right. So that's sustainment.
So what comes next?
And fourth is milestones. This is the indictment has been delivered, charges have been filed, crash report is out.
Right. The black box.
The black box has been found.
Yeah.
Those are milestones that you can expect. The news is gonna cycle.
If it's a real story, you're gonna get further into the details, and it's gonna continue to be a story. If it's not a real story, it goes away. But if it's real and if it's a public information, then this is the process, right?
Right, exactly so. But that's important to note because the story is going to be rehashed. So again, how well you do with those initial reports. Right. Is going to be critical to how you're viewed as you go through these different stages.
I'm going to go to do the air quotes new,
right?
Because it's not always new. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just a rehash of what was known or a debunking of false information. But every time new information comes out, the story comes back up again and it recycles through the whole process.
Absolutely, and that's important for the professional to note because you know it's going to cycle on those milestones.
It's going to happen. Be prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. And then last is anniversaries. Anniversaries, come every time. It's the 1 year, it's the 5 year, it's the 10 year.
Right.
We're getting ready to memorialize the 25th anniversary of the bombing in Oklahoma City.
Right.
Those things, particularly on disasters or crises of those size, that's going to continue on for some very long time.
The larger it is and the more in the public eye, then the more likely to have anniversary responses.
Yeah, continuous anniversary responses. Sometimes you'll get lucky and they'll say, we're bored after 5 years, but most of the time that's not the case.
And again, your response to the crisis can become the positive outcome of the negative thing that happened. And I think Oklahoma City is a great example. The Murrah building bombing Timmy McVeigh and his cohorts. It was a tragic event. Hundreds of people lost their lives on that day, and it was an emergency. It was all of the things that goes into a crisis. But the response immediately, our first responders, the citizens themselves, and then the law enforcement, they caught them, FBI, the prosecution, but then how Oklahoma City took this super negative and then still today are doing positive things from the process that started with trying to just literally fix the crater we had in the ground through what Oklahoma City has done up to today and I think in the future. And one of the things we've done extremely well, the memorial to it and the Museum of Terrorism, et cetera, and then our annual remembrances that we will continue on forever are very much a very positive response to a extremely negative event.
Exactly. And that's what Seeger, Selnow, and Elmer talk about. That's what we like to talk about, and that is seizing that opportunity that's buried inside of a tragedy.
There you go. So let's get a few basic truths about crisis communication.
Okay, and again, this is Mrs. Pritchard's little boy's take, but the door always blows off at 1600.
And for those of you not in the military, that's 4 p.m.
Right, usually on Friday.
I'm so impressed with myself. I know that 1600 is 4 p.m. 12 plus
12,
okay.
4 minus 12 is...
Yeah, 4
anyway,
p.m. on a
go
Friday,
4
right?
p.m. on a Friday.
Why? Why
4
is that?
p.m. on a Friday of a 3-day weekend.
Of course.
4 p.m. of a Friday on a 3-day weekend, and you have non-refundable tickets to take your significant other someplace.
And the weather is beautiful, and the last thing you want to do is be at work.
Right.
But
why is that important? Because when the door does blow off, and you know that it's coming,
right.
First of all, it's not unexpected anymore because, 1600 on Friday.
Here it
there
comes.
it is. Here it comes. And while everybody else in the office is screaming and running with their hair on fire, you're the calm in the storm because
you need to be.
You need to be, absolutely. But you are because you anticipated that's going to happen, right?
Yes.
More often than not, I've throughout my career anyway, this is a truth. 1600 on Friday.
Here's another truth for you.
Right.
Unlike fine wine,
Yes.
bad news does not get better with age.
That's exactly right.
So speed is the essence when the story is bad.
Yep, absolutely. And I think we talk about this in a later slide, but I'm putting a stake in the ground that 1 hour
Yes.
is the time frame.
And we will give you detail on how that works on 1 hour.
Absolutely. Okay. Success, and this was good news to me, not totally dependent upon talent. You can learn how to be a good crisis communicator.
For sure. You won't know it immediately, and it's not necessarily instinctually. This is why we have protocols and we have training, and this is why we're talking about it now, to help you figure out what to do in your career as the professional self and then on the job for the organization themselves. So it's not a thing that you're just born with or skilled at. You have to work at it.
Some people are naturals, but it is possible to train for it. It is possible to study it because there are lots of lessons that have been learned by other folks out there.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be a natural necessarily in order to be successful.
So when it comes to crisis communication, timing is everything.
Timing is everything. And that is the respond within 1 hour.
There you go.
And I picked that because I've looked through all the literature, all the crisis communications research that's been done, and I think I found one reference to a time frame. Everybody just says fast. Well, I'm gonna put a stake in the ground.
Fast is anyone you can. Fast could be 5 seconds or 5 hours. Who knows?
Exactly. I'm going with 1 hour,
I like
and
it.
I take that from my military training, where there was a requirement in terms of an accident or an incident. You had to have what you were going to say with dirty questions and clean answers up the chain of command within 1 hour.
I like it. And also, for my role here at the Golden Group, of course, social media is one of my specialties. And we talked about how fast social media happens in those initial reports, and they're usually wrong and conspiratorial and all that. But you can get on social media too fast.
Right?
But too long.
Right.
And I think Olive Garden waited too long to get on social media with their crisis. So I do think this hour time frame is exactly right.
Well, and I do too, because I think it's long enough for you to be able to gather your facts,
Yes.
but it's short enough that you're still relevant. You're still in the game.
Yes.
You have not occupied the playing field for a little while, but that doesn't mean that you're not in the game.
Right. Also, not being too fast into social media often will allow supporters, fans of your brand, the white knight to come in and defend you, and you don't even have to sometimes.
Right.
And that's a little bit more to do with like negative reviews and some things like that. Actual crisis, you need to go ahead and defend yourself. But having other people who aren't getting a paycheck from your company or work for your brand to actually represent you in a positive light is definitely beneficial. And then the second half of that again is when you follow that up with an official announcement with the truth to set you free, that supports what your white knights have been doing and pushes back on the negative and what we often think is going to be the wrong initial reporting.
Right.
You're in a very good position at that point.
Absolutely. And that is another critical advantage to giving yourself an hour.
Yes.
Is that it gives your advocates time to come up on the net as well.
And I think the last thing, too, is something you see in Twitter a lot now, especially with how some of our government officials use Twitter, is a single misspelled word, punctuation point, using the wrong version of your, and you are, or there and there, right? All the things that are easy to do, and sometimes it's autocorrect, and sometimes it's just human error, but sometimes the message is lost because of a misspelled word or a mispronunciation or a misuse of tense. And that would be the worst scenario for you, just trying to move so fast that you don't parse every single word in the sentence of the 280 characters you have on Twitter to make sure that you are communicating as clearly as possible and not taking the focus off the message, but putting it on something that's irrelevant.
Absolutely. And it goes to your credibility, too. If you can't even tell the difference between your and you are, then your credibility is diminished. So
another basic truth about crisis communication is preparation.
Absolutely. Preparation is the answer to well before the incident. You can't. Sometimes you're going to have to figure stuff out in the middle of the crisis.
Right.
But if you're prepared, those elements are going to be very, very minor. So pour the energy into it. And we talk about tabletops, which is where you just sit around as the players sit around a table and talk through what they're going to do in the event of a particular kind of crisis. And then there's the field training exercise, which is we're shutting the shop down for a half a day and we're actually going to execute like we would.
And something I find that's an additional bonus benefit to being that extensive in your training is it drives home the importance to everyone in the building, from the CEO down to the interns, about the importance of doing this right.
Right.
And the value of your training and staying out of the way when the crisis actually happens.
Right. And I'm going to digress for just a minute, because for the professionals, this is where you earn your seat at the table.
Right, absolutely.
Sidney Finkelstein, business professor.
This is where you gain the collect those paychecks on those easy weeks where nothing's happening, because you got to double, triple, quadruple down in a crisis scenario.
Right. Finkelstein talks about 4 dimensions of power, and there's ownership, and there's the expert power that he talks about is where the public relations professional steps in, particularly in a crisis, because you are the one who has to handle it. You are the one who knows how to handle it. And if you're taking our guidance, you're going to be even better.
Yes.
Shameless plug.
You can do it.
Absolutely. But this is where you earn your seat at the table.
That's right. So no matter how much preparation you have, because a lot of preparation is good, but it's only going to prepare you to a certain point, because every single scenario and every single crisis is very different. All the factors are different. It's different if it happens at 4 o'clock on Friday than 2 p.m. on Tuesday.
Right.
Is the CEO involved, or is it the product itself? Is it something in your control, out of your control? Is it unplanned, planned? All these factors make every response to crisis communication completely different, right? So you can have a level of preparation, but you can't completely prepare totally. You will be caught by surprise, right?
Well, this is for all the type A's out there, all the perfectionists. No matter how well you prepare, you're going to be surprised.
That's right.
There's going to be something that you haven't thought about, or something new.
And sometimes it's those incorrect reports. Sometimes it's unfair reporting, as far as you think it's unfair, you feel attacked. A lot of it's unsubstantiated. There's all these things, but you can't be sad or mad about it. You just have to do your job, right?
You have to understand that it happens. Don't beat yourself up about it. Don't paralyze yourself because you were surprised. Just deal with it. I mean, it's just important to know what's going to happen.
And that lack of ability to prepare 100%, that surprise that can happen, and the factors that go into it is why we are so emphatic about having protocols in place.
Absolutely.
Because you need responses that can't be canned or written down, as opposed to a plan.
Yeah. Long live the plan. I won't even ask for a moment of silence.
Too bad you're gone.
Too bad, so sad.
Strategic plan for crisis communication is out.
Yep.
Crisis communication protocols are more effective in 2019 and going forward.
Absolutely.
With that, folks, we're going to end this episode. This is the basics of crisis communication, but next episode, in 2 weeks, we will explain what a crisis communication protocol is, how you develop one, why it's important, which I think we've explained pretty well here, and then real-world examples of how it could benefit your business as opposed to a plan.
Absolutely.
So with that, folks, make sure you guys check the link in our social media below for the deck that we're talking about. Listen to this episode. Be ready for the next episode. You can get next episode automatically if you subscribe. So subscribe, YouTube, on iTunes, and all the different places that you find the podcast. We appreciate your subscription. Tune in 2 weeks for the second half of this conversation all about crisis communication. Until then, good luck.
Ciao.